number of civilian casualties reported in the Hamas-Israel War has caused much anguish around the world, prompting many demands for an immediate ceasefire. There have undoubtedly been many casualties among the people of the Gaza Strip, a source of deep regret for most people. Yet as early as November 2023, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, or JCPA, described the Gaza casualty figures as a scam. They had reached 15,000, said to include 6,150 children, or 41%, and 4,000 women, or 26%. The JCPA highlighted that after similar Gaza battles in 2014, reported casualties included just 16% children and 15% women, indicating that in the current war, Hamas are keeping male casualty figures low through unreported mass burials. The JCPA also noted that Dr. Munir al-Bush, Director General of the Palestinian Health Ministry, which produces the casualty figures, is a member of the government in Gaza, which means that a paid employee of Hamas was responsible for producing the casualty figures. In January 2024, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy published research titled "How Hamas Manipulates Gaza Fatality Numbers." Acknowledging that civilian harm is inevitable in urban battles where terrorist fighters hide among the population and refuse to surrender, it noted that Hamas-produced casualty figures were relied upon almost universally by international media, non-governmental organizations, and the International Court of Justice. But detailed analysis of the figures, accepting the difficulty of obtaining accurate ones in a war, led to the conclusion that Hamas-produced statistics are inconsistent, imprecise, and appear to have been systematically manipulated to downplay the number of militants killed and to exaggerate the proportion of non-combatants confirmed as dead. Further to that analysis, in March 2024, Tablet magazine produced an article by Abraham Weiner, Professor of Statistics and Data Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Examining casualty figures from a 2-week period in October and November 2023, he observed that they rose in a regular, almost linear pattern, which suggests they were not real because there was none of the natural variation that occurs in such situations. Second, he noted that there was no significant correlation between the women casualties and the child casualties, which is most unusual as they would normally be together in homes or shelters. And third, he calculated that there was no significant correlation between the number of men and the number of women casualties, something that should be expected in the ebb and flow of fighting. Thus, from a statistical perspective, there is significant evidence that those casualty figures had been fabricated. The first concern raised by Professor Weiner is reflected in a brief review published by The Lancet in December 2023, in which the authors claimed there was no obvious inflation of the overall figures. Yet their chart of casualty figures between the 7th of October and 10th of November 2023 showed the almost linear pattern that Professor Weiner described as unnatural. The BBC is a major media organisation which regularly quotes the Hamas figures and, in defence of them, it published a Verify article in December 2023. It starts with quotes from various officials, such as the World Health Organization's Richard Brennan, who considered the Gaza casualty figures trustworthy. But rather than focusing on the casualty figures themselves, the BBC added quotes from so-called military experts about Israel's use of very large bombs, many of which, they said, are unguided and likely to cause more civilian casualties. They also used imprecise quotes expressing opinions from wartime casualty experts like Professor Michael Spaggott, who said he would not be at all surprised if around 80% of those killed were civilians. The BBC analysis was far less rigorous than the others quoted above, relying on quotes that favour accuracy of the Hamas numbers and the BBC's line of reporting, rather than probing the contradictions and inconsistencies in the casualty figures. In contrast to that effort by the BBC, an article for the National Review by Danielle Pletka, Senior Fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, highlighted some of the obvious errors and contradictions in the Hamas figures. For example, on one day the sum of the women and the children casualties exceeded the total number reported. In another instance, there were no male casualties at all, just women and children, which is extremely unlikely. While acknowledging the fog of war, she summarized the situation by saying, "The cumulative problems of unreliable Hamas reporting, battlefield uncertainty, the media's lack of information, and additionally media bias suggest that the numbers of fatalities and casualties emanating from Gaza as authoritative have been increasingly untethered to reality." In the light of all this, it should be a matter of great concern that major media outlets continue to quote the Hamas-produced figures, especially when some quote them as being purely civilian casualties and make no mention of Israeli estimates of the number of terrorists killed. However close to reality the overall casualty numbers might be, the evidence points to a major distortion of the number of men and terrorists who have died. That distortion has had a major impact upon international public perception of Israel's conduct of this war against terrorists who are intent on its destruction.